So here we go. And okay, so here we go. Welcome everyone to the first online event of the Weber Scholars Network on Weber and methodology. I'm Victor Strazzeri. I'm a co-founder of the network, and it's a really great pleasure to to do our first online event on not only a really essential topic for Weber studies in general, but also with with amazing participants in our discussion. We have first the author of the text that is the origin of this discussion, or that will be the basis for our talk today, Erik Jansson Boström, who works at the Department of Philosophy at Uppsala University in Sweden. And to tell you a little bit about Erik, research focuses mainly on the ideal type and its foundations. And in May 2020, he finished his thesis dissertation, Max Weber and the Necessity of Ideal Types, which he wrote in Swedish. And we're all very curious to know what's in there, and we're going to hear about that today. And we have also the pleasure of welcoming Henrik Bruun, who is connected today from Copenhagen. He's an MA in political science, which he earned in 1971. And his thesis from 1972, Science, Values, and Politics in Max Weber's Methodology, is from the year after that, from 1972, but was published in a revised and expanded edition in 2007. And I think it's a text many of us will be familiar with. He's worked for the Danish Foreign Service since the 1970s until 2003, at which point he became an adjunct professor at the Department of Sociology, the University of Copenhagen. And he's, of course, the co-editor and translator of Max Weber Collected Methodological Writings from 2012, which he co-edited with a member of our audience today, Sam Whimster. And he's the editor and translator of the Danish translation of Weber's Protestant Ethic. And so just before we start our discussion, just to tell you very quickly about our network. So the idea with the Weber Scholars Network is to bring together, especially early career scholars, but in general, scholars interested in Max Weber, either in his work itself, or scholars who work with or in dialogue with Max Weber somehow across the disciplines and throughout the world. And yeah, our idea is not only to reflect on his legacy as a thinker, but on his actuality and what he has to tell us regarding questions in the social sciences or in society in general today, and to do so also from a critical perspective. And another point that maybe I want to emphasize is that this network is also trying to bring Marianne Weber into the picture, and we're going to have also events based on her work and her thought as well. So we were just talking about that before we start recording. So with that, with no further ado, I'd like to ask Erik now to talk a little bit about, or are we starting with you, Erik, or are you giving us a summary of the talk, or are we going directly to Henrik because we've all read your text? Maybe I should have asked you this before.
I think it's better if Henrik starts,
okay,
and I will comment on his reflections.
Yes, so in our blog, you will find a text from Erik on Max Weber methodology. And so now this is accessible there. So we're going to hear first Henrik's comment on the text, and then we'll have an answer from Erik, and we'll open to our audience for questions. So that's how it is. So Henrik, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that this sort of exercise is never very fair, because the aim of it, of course, is to furnish a base for discussion. So it concentrates on the points that seem debatable, and that is also what I shall do. But to avoid misunderstanding, let me say at the outset that I find Erik's paper balanced and thorough and very interesting precisely because it throws up important points for debate. Now, the general subject that Erik has taken up is that of objectivity. And I must confess that the chapter on objectivity in my thesis was one of the most difficult ones to write. I was never really satisfied with it, and I think it's courageous of Erik to try to tackle that particular question. And as a general remark, I shall use the concepts that Erik quotes Sven Eliasson as having used the textualist and the contextual approach, just to start. Now, I have 5 main points that I'd like to touch on. First, I have some questions regarding Erik's so-called philosophical approach. Secondly, I should like to show that it is necessary to read Weber not only textually, but also contextually. Thirdly, I shall discuss Erik's criticism of my translation of the German word Färbung. Then I shall deal with Erik's claim that values enter into the constitution of reality to such an extent that they prevent the formulation of non-subjective results in the cultural sciences, and therefore that they contradict Weber's assertion that such non-subjective results are possible. And finally, and connected with this, I shall offer some remarks on Weber's criteria of truth in the cultural sciences. Now, to start with the first point, Erik claims that a philosophical reading of Weber's methodology can give us a fundamental insight into his views on, and I quote, the nature of reality and what it means to be human. And he takes it for granted that Weber actually has something philosophically important to tell us in his methodological essays. Now, I can certainly accept that Weber's methodological essays, and particularly the objectivity essay, have something interesting and valuable, and perhaps even profound, to tell us about the nature of reality, or perhaps more precisely about how to arrive at a valid knowledge of reality and why certain ideas about arriving at such valid knowledge are mistaken. But what do we learn about what it means to be human in these essays? Now, at a pinch, I would grant that Weber's definition of culture does introduce something that ties up with the idea of being human, namely when he says that culture is what we humans endow with meaning and significance. But frankly, that is really common knowledge and mostly, in fact, serves a definitional purpose, which is that of distinguishing between the natural and the cultural sciences. In fact, this idea of culture is at the very basis of the philosopher Heinrich Rickert's discussion of the cultural sciences, which he calls the historical sciences, and I shall come back to Rickert in a moment. But apart from that definition of culture, I myself would say that the most important contribution that Weber himself makes to our knowledge of what it means to be human is his insistence, particularly in his value freedom essay and the 2 lectures on science and politics as a vocation, that we as humans must choose and fight for our leading values, and that we cannot scientifically prove these values to be the right ones. This is, in fact, one of the 2 central formulations of Weber's principle of value freedom, and it has profound implications, but it is not part of Erik's argument. That was the first point. The second point is that Erik claims that a central element in his philosophical approach is to pay particular attention to the most difficult passages in Weber's methodological writings, rather than the more straightforward ones. And my question, which is a naive one, is I wonder why. I don't think that there's any intrinsic reason why an important philosophical point may not be found in a straightforward passage. And I also, therefore, fail to see why we should favor the, and I quote, elusive and cryptic passages as Erik exhorts us to do. I would rather suggest the following method of analysis. First, one should try to establish by a textual analysis, and without obviously too much strain in the interpretation, if all statements on a given subject can be seen as being in harmony with each other. Now, if that is not possible, that is, if there seems to be some sort of internal textual contradiction, then one should start looking for contextual elements which might help to explain the contradiction. Now, this method obviously doesn't necessarily make away with the contradiction. It probably seldom will make away with it, but it may help to situate it more precisely, so to speak. In the present case, I can point to the following, what I think are relevant contextual facts. First, in my opinion, Weber's methodological essays are piecemeal. They're written as occasional pieces, and they are to a significant extent polemical. They're not written with a view to producing an orderly system of thought. Secondly, the very word objectivity is put in quotation marks in the title of the objectivity essay. Thirdly, in that essay, Weber actually tells us very little about objectivity. It might even be said, and I think I've said so myself, that the objectivity essay is really all about subjectivity. And finally, I should remind you that Weber himself insists that in the objectivity essay, he's not claiming to provide anything new, but is mainly building on the writings of others, particularly the thought of Heinrich Rickert. There he comes again. Now, for polemical purposes in particular, Rickert's philosophical system, which is based on the concept of value relation, is an excellent instrument, a real battle axe. He's a good and clear systematizer, and in his neo-Kantian philosophical system, he introduces a value element into the process by which scholars try to get results which are non-subjective, that is, objective. Now, Rickert can do this and still demonstrate the objectivity of the results of the cultural sciences, because his system is anchored in the idea of the objectiveness of the values that enter into the value relation. So, however, it's common knowledge that Weber never subscribed to Rickert's system in its entirety. Therefore, there is already here an inbuilt contradiction or fault line in Weber's argument, and very important writers like Guy Oakes and Thomas Berger have spent a lot of time and ink on showing exactly that this is so. With this in mind, I think that any contradiction to be found in Weber's argument should first be tested against the possibility that it can be explained by reference to the divergence between Weber and Rickert, and I shall revert to a good instance of this a little later. Thirdly, Erik focuses on the term color or coloration, Färbung in German, in one of the passages that he analyzes. He finds the term and the concept that it denotes to be crucial for an understanding of Weber's view of the nature of reality, and wonders, therefore, why I have in one instance translated it as aspect. Now, let me try to explain. In my translation of Weber's methodological text, I stressed that a number of terms were not used by Weber in a technical sense, so that it wasn't necessary for the translator to show complete consistency in the translation of the term. In any event, I venture to say that Weber was often somewhat sloppy in his terminology, generally. I've written an article about what happens in economy and society with Verstehen and Deuten, for instance. But Färbung is, in my opinion, one instance of a non-technical term in Weber's writings. I will maintain this while I do recognize that Weber uses Farbe towards the end of the objectivity essay in a context where it may be said to be concomitant, if not perhaps a complete synonym, of Bedeutung, that is significance, with technical connotations, just as Erik thinks that it should be interpreted. In the passage where I translated Färbung as aspect, it is used in a discussion of the distinction between the quantitative Beziehungen, relationships between celestial bodies, and the qualitative Färbung der Vorgänge, the qualitative coloration or aspect of the processes. I might well have used coloring in my translation, but actually in that context, I found that aspect would be more natural and also, in fact, more precise. Coloring would have tended to imply that there were other possible colorings, whereas aspect suggests to the reader the simple dichotomy between quantitative on one side and qualitative on the other. I'm certainly not suggesting that aspect will always be the best translation of Färbung, and I very often, in fact, translate it as coloring, and I'm quite open to replacing that with hue or tint, if you like, it being understood that neither of those two words is, in my opinion, a technical one. I can also, at a pinch, accept Erik's statement that the significance is the color, but I don't think it matters very much. Significance is bestowed on certain elements of reality, so Weber says, by virtue of the application of certain value ideas, and those elements are colored as significant by this application. But I don't think that this affects the epistemological status of those elements with or without coloring. They are selected, they are not intrinsically affected on the basis of values. Now, the fourth point, I'm coming to the end. In his conclusion, Erik tries to show that two statements by Weber are incompatible, and that one of them seems to eliminate the possibility of a cultural science whose results will be binding on everyone, what he calls the relativistic interpretation. Incidentally, Weber hated that particular word and its implications. However, much of Erik's conclusion here, in my opinion, rests on a misunderstanding of the term value. Weber's philosophical battle axe, Rickert, says that the objects of the cultural sciences are constituted on the basis of a relation to values, Wertbeziehung. But according to Rickert, a value entering into a value relation is a theoretical value, which must be kept strictly apart from practical values or valuations, at least on the research level, not perhaps on the object level, but on the research level. Now, what does he mean? Well, he means, for instance, that a political historian will, by definition, accept the theoretical value of politics since he's discussing it. And generally, for instance, he says that all scholars will, by definition, accept the theoretical value of truth. Therefore, in Rickert's system, theoretical values do not, indeed by definition, they cannot impair the non-subjective character of the results of the cultural sciences. Now, Weber completely agrees with this. He also underlines that we can opt out of any theoretical value, even that of truth. This is why Weber talks so much about what interests people. If you're interested in politics, you share that value with the political historian, and the historian's result will perhaps interest you. Again, if you're not interested in scientific truth at all, you will probably not be interested in academic essays, and you would rather be interested in, say, romantic fiction or something like that. Weber even underlines the fact that in certain cases, a scholar's interest in a subject may be grounded in his or her subjective personal animosity or sympathy. But this, Weber says, need not detract from the non-subjectivity of the results. He carries this theoretical point out in practice. If you remember his discussion of Juncker economic policies in West Prussia in his inaugural lecture, he is deeply committed to a nationalist abhorrence of what the Junkers are doing, but there's nothing non-subjective in his analysis as such. And then finally, the question of the criteria of truth. Now, much of the problem with the objectivity essay is, as Erik points out, that Weber says next to nothing about objectivity in it, hence perhaps the quotation marks around the word in the title, nor does he say anything much of the criteria of objective truth. He usually restricts himself to claiming that the results of the cultural sciences are not subjective, which is why I have talked of non-subjective results and not of objective ones. But he doesn't spill out at all how this non-subjectivity is to be ensured in practice, except characteristically by appealing to the scholar's conscience. So why should we accept the results that cultural scientists come up with? Well, in this connection, Erik talks of results that everybody would agree on, and this is a quotation. And if this should be taken to imply that Weber subscribed to some sort of consensus theory of truth, I venture to disagree. There is a central passage in this respect, which I think Erik could, with profit, have quoted, since it very much belongs to the group of elusive and cryptic passages in Weber, which says, scientific truth is only that which claims validity for all who seek truth. Now, this is pure Rickert. Scientific truth is not defined as something arrived at by concrete means or processes. It is that which claims validity for all who seek truth. It's a very non-operative definition, in fact. Now, Rickert, as we know, grounded the objectivity of the cultural sciences in the objectivity of the theoretical values to which these results were related. And that objectivity was the basis of the claims of the results to be objective. Weber would have none of that. But the fact that he nevertheless writes the sentence I quote, and writes so little about the modern criteria of ascertaining truth, shows that he may, in fact, when it comes to the criteria of truth, still think along Rickertian lines. It's only when we come to objectivity, about which Weber says so little, that he breaks with Rickert without providing anything systematically satisfactory in its place. So there may be contradictions which are, in my opinion, far deeper than those arriving from possible differing views on the nature of reality, and they continue, to my mind, to be fascinating, even if they don't tell us anything much about what it means to be human. Thank you. I'm sorry if I was a little long.
No, that was perfect. No, thank you very much, Hans-Henrik, for this really compelling and fantastically well-prepared intervention. So, Erik, you have the floor for your response.
Yes, thank you very much for your comments. I must say that it's an honor to be here and talk to you today. It was a very fruitful and thoughtful presentation you had, and I will try to keep my presentation quite short so we can have an open discussion afterwards. So let's just start from the beginning. You ask if it's justified to regard Weber as having profound philosophical views. And especially when it comes to the question of what it means to be human. And I think the obvious answer is yes, but I don't really know how to justify it. I just feel when I read Weber that his texts are very rich and thoughtful, and very often I feel that he's onto something, that he's probably right, even if he can't really express what he's trying to say very clearly. But I would say that at this point, it's really important, I would say, to remember that the act of interpreting needs to be understood in, it's an artistic act, sort of, I would say, where you need to read Weber and to understand him. It's not just a question of reading what he claims or what he says, but also adding something when you read him. I think you have to cherish this kind of attitude when you read Weber. And if you do that, I feel that you can learn a lot about what it means to be human if you read him. So that's why I think it's justified to sort of read him as a philosopher. And the other side of this point is that I don't want to be able to give reasons for why I have this approach. I just feel that this is something that you can experience when you read him. And it's not often you feel this when you read classical texts or authors, I would say. So that's like the main first point. And when it comes to the question of what we learn when it comes to what it means to be human, I would say that one of the main aspects I think is important is the stress, how it stresses the importance of the ideal types and the relation between the ideal type and making a judgment. It's very easy to interpret the ideal types as classificatory concepts, and I think that's a very common interpretation among social scientists at large, but even perhaps among some Weber scholars. And I think there's a difference between understanding a concept as a classificatory concept and as an object of comparison. And as you all know, he uses that kind of expressions in the objectivity essay. And I think it's really important to realize the difference between classifying and comparing. And in that sense, when we read the objectivity essay and really try to understand what he's saying about the ideal type, we can get a sense of what his vision is of what it means to be a social scientist, what it means to interpret and try to understand, for example, historical events and so on. So that's like the first point. And then you ask why I mainly focus on why I think we should focus on the difficult passages. And I would put it like this, that established views are easy to express because there are conventional ways to express those thoughts. But when you have an original thought, something new, a new idea, it's hard to put that into words because there's no real conventions for how to express it. And that's why there's a potential in the difficult passages. Maybe something is hidden there that he failed to express in a clear way. So that's like my answer to that. And then you make this argument on how to study Weber, where you argue that we should start with a textual approach and try to find harmony within the text. And if we can't find that harmony, if we find contradictions, we should go to this contextual approach and look at the historical background and so on. But I would say that this is maybe a point where we disagree. Mm-hmm. And I can see from my text that it's not very clear, but when I'm talking about this philosophical approach in the first part of my blog post, I try to illustrate that approach in the second part. So I wouldn't call the second part of my text a textual reading of Weber. I can see why it's not a contextual reading, but I would call it a philosophical reading of Weber. And what I mean with that is connected to my first point with this artistic approach, where we have to really value what it means to read someone. To read a text, it's not just to take in information. When we read something, we add something as a reader. That's like my main point. And I think it's important to have that kind of approach when you believe someone has something important to say. It's not just an act of trying to understand what they have been saying, but the meaning is created in the meeting between me as a reader and the text that I'm reading. And that's why it's important to sort of, if you believe that there are philosophical insights to be gained from reading the objectivity essay, for example, from my perspective, if you read him as a philosopher, you both have to see him as a philosopher or believe that he has philosophical potential. And you have to take the stance as a philosopher yourself when you're reading the text. So you have to be more creative in your reading. And I know that Eliasson, when he discusses these different approaches, he talks about the retrospective approach, where you sort of cherry pick and you try to just make the classical thinker into like an ally. It's a kind of unfair reading. And I can see that the philosophical reading that I am defending might look like a retrospective reading, but I think one could make the case that there's a difference here too. And the importance when it comes to this philosophical approach is to try to answer important question on a general level, not just something that's a part of a debate, a contemporary debate. So that's what I was trying to do. And I understand that from this contextual approach, my interpretation of Weber might look problematic. But I tried to say something that could be important for us and for future generations, like be a part of this philosophical tradition. That's like the aim, even if it's a difficult task. So I try to present Weber in the most interesting way that I can. That's like my basic point. So if we move on to this, your comment about the term Färbung and coloration and your translation, I didn't really mean to criticize your translation.
Quite welcome.
No, but actually I think this is a quite important point, because I agree with you that it's not a technical term, but I think it's also important to remember that Weber almost never uses technical terms. And I guess one could even argue that the ideal type, that term, is not a technical term, because it's, as we all know, it's very difficult to pinpoint what the definition of an ideal type would be, because he uses that term in very many different ways. And it seems like that term is signifying a very rich area of thoughts and ideas. And I think this is also connected to this, my first point, that I feel that we live in an age where we sort of, we think that clarity has to do with definitions and classifications, and that we can reach important scientific results if we have this clear terminology where we can just measure and classify events and phenomena and so on. But I think that Weber really understands on a very deep level what it means to understand something and interpret something. And I think that's why he's promoting this idea of the ideal type. And if he tried to pinpoint what an ideal type is, I think that he would fail. I think there's something important in this, and that is connected to this idea what it means to formulate a judgment, whether it's within working life at large, like in a professional judgment, in the law enforcement or healthcare or wherever, or when we do social science. A judgment is something, a good judgment is something that you need in order to formulate like a good interpretation of something and reach a deep understanding of something. And I think it's the same with this term, Färbung, that it's not a technical term, and when you translate, of course, you can't really translate everything just as it is. You have to make choices. But my point was just that as a reader of the English text, there's a risk that you miss this connection if you read the German original. And I think that the term Färbung is important for how to spell out what the significance or meaning is. And I was very happy to hear that you, if I understood you correctly, that you accept that one can say that the significance, the cultural significance, the Kulturbedeutung, could be seen as the coloration of phenomena. I think that's terrific. And when it comes to the value relations, I can see that it looks like I've misunderstood, or that I haven't really considered this distinction between practical and theoretical values, or the theoretical value relation. But I think that's mainly because I was running out of space, actually. And I'm just happy that Victor let me write like twice as long as I was supposed to from the start, but I had to really keep it very, very short. And I would put it like this, that, and maybe this is a point where we disagree, but I'm not certain that we disagree. And that is that, for example, I was rereading the objectivity essay again, and on page 129 and 130 in your translation, the English version, he talks about the importance of formulating ideal types of ideas, such as liberalism or socialism, and how easy it is to mix up the ideal type as a theoretical construct and your own idea of what liberalism should be or socialism should be. And that's why it's important to try to formulate the ideal types from a theoretical value point in order to separate yourself from the theoretical tool that you are constructing. So at least in this passage, the theoretical value relation plays a role for the construction of the ideal types. And of course, that means also that the theoretical value relation is really important for the empirical analysis, where you compare the empirical material to your ideal types, of course. And this is a point where I'm very curious on what you would say, but the empirical material that we are comparing to the ideal types, or that we are analyzing with the help of ideal types, and within this setting where we are interested in the meaning of the cultural phenomena, of course, when we're doing cultural science in the sense he's talking about here, isn't it true that the empirical material will always be colored by values in and of itself? Because, and this connects back to my point about what it means to read. When we read a text, it's not just taking in of information. We add something as readers when we read a text. That's what understanding is. And within psychology, of course, it's common knowledge today that there's not just sense data. It's not just that we see the world as it is. We have perception of the world, but our perception of the world is already sort of arranged and categorized and affected by our interests and our values and so on. So there's no such thing as a pure observation, of course. And if the empirical material is already colored by our values, it doesn't help that the ideal types are constructed from a theoretical value standpoint. That's like my basic point of view. And I mean, this is my point of view, but I would also say that Weber himself understood this, especially in the Rocher and Knies essays. I think it's quite clear that he thinks of the given reality as already colored by our values. He has this one passage, and of course this is very influenced by Rickert, but I think that he's not just presenting Rickert's view, but he's presenting views of Rickert's which he himself defends or thinks are good. So in one instance, he says that I can't really remember exactly how he phrases this, but he's talking about the difference between a diamond and like a coal seam in the ground, and that they have different values, and or rather that they have a different qualitative aspect. I think that's more accurate. And when the natural scientist says that the diamond is just an arrangement of these atoms, it's the diamond for us humans is not just carbon, right? It's something else. It's primarily a diamond that means something to us. And I think that's like his basic understanding of what it means to experience reality when it talks about Erlebnis and so on. So I think that when he develops this or defends this idea of the theoretical value relations in relation to the construction of ideal types, it's an attempt to solve sort of the conflict between the subjective and the objective side of interpretations. But I think that in the end, it doesn't help. So that's what I mean when I say that I think that this is sort of a hidden truth within Weber's works that we can see and understand and appreciate if we read him as philosophers. That's like my main point, I guess. And just to finish, when it comes to your points about truth, I agree with you. I wouldn't want to say that he has this like this sort of consensus idea about truth. That's not what I'm trying to say, even though I understand that it might sound like that. And actually, I don't really have any good answer to what he means by truth and his take on truth. So that's also another question that I have. So to conclude, I would just like to pose two questions to you, Hans-Henrik. First of all, I would just like to hear your take on this philosophical approach. Do you think there's some kind of value in it, or do you think that it's a dead end, sort of? That would be terrific to hear something about. And I would also like to hear your thoughts on my response to your thoughts on the theoretical value relation in relation to meaning or significance. That's like my main 2 points. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erik. Yeah, go right ahead, Hans-Henrik.
Right. Let me start by a little bit of personal history. When I first started dealing with Weber's methodology. This was in 1972. At that point, there wasn't really a huge body yet of literature on the subject. And some of what you actually found was not very convincing and sometimes based on misreadings on Weber, which was why I said in my introduction in 1972 that what I wanted to do was to try to show what Weber really wrote and perhaps what he really meant. Now, this is a confessedly lean way of looking at Weber. And there's no doubt that my general way of approaching Weber has been has been of that lean character, which is to say that I found enough to go on with discussions and contradictions and so on that already arose out of the material without trying to go into a completely different approach. Of course, Erik, you are at the Faculty of Philosophy, and I've never been at the Faculty of Philosophy. And there's a very good reason for that, because I would be a very, very poor philosopher if I tried. So from that point of view, I can understand why you want to do something different with even with the methodological essays than I would like to do or be able to do. And of course, you're not alone. I mean, you have some very interesting and profound thinkers who have in different ways tried to discuss Weber in a more philosophical manner, just to mention one, Dieter Henrich. And you have others, and some are more persuasive than others, but still. And all I can say is that I have personal difficulties with moving from my way of dealing with him to your way of dealing with it, but I can see that there are, of course, different ways of doing it. What I want to do sometimes in that case is to hold the reins, nevertheless, of the horse that you're trying to make gallop off in a slightly different direction, to make sure that in doing so, you do not become overmuch retrospective in trying to make what Weber actually says fit into something that you want him to be saying. And I must say that I've been a little bit in your position myself, because when I started my interest in Weber's methodology in the early 70s, what I thought I could find would be the proof, if you like, that Weber had moved radically beyond Rickert and on to a modern social science with modern social science criteria. And I tried, and after 672 pages, I had to realize that it was not to be, because it could not be done like that. There was still rather too much Rickert left, so to speak. But I've been, if you like, a little bit in your own position. You wanted to try something new with it, which I think is interesting. If we can just move for a moment to the other question that you asked me was a question of your view of the theoretical value relation. I think that one of the curious lacunae sometimes in discussions of Weber and values is that many commentators try to think that Wert is the same as Wertung. But of course it isn't. And there's a huge difference between them. The Wert is based on Rickert, something that can at any rate be theoretical, a guide for theoretical thought. A Wertung is something that you run around doing in everyday life. And you have even found people who say that Weber should have called his essay Wertungsfreiheit and not Wertfreiheit, without realizing that of course he wanted to call it Wertfreiheit, because he never actually, in his whole work, as far as I remember, Edith, you could perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he ever uses the term Wertungsfreiheit. Is that so? Yeah, he doesn't. Just to say that Wert is something, it has a tendency to move upwards into the clouds, the philosophical clouds, so to speak, whereas Wertungs very much stay on the ground. And of course, Wertungen would contaminate your view of facts and reality, whereas values, Werte, will somehow be so far away. I sometimes return to a lovely phrase in Rickert, where he says, a fact is what I ought to think, which is really a way of saying how much he's removed from what I would say would be the ordinary way of looking at the objects of empirical social science. He's somewhere quite different up in the clouds. But I can see that, of course, you quote from Roscher and Knies the passage about the piece of coal and the diamond. And of course, what he says and what Rickert says is the central difference is that the diamond is, as a diamond, indivisible. If you try to cut it into pieces, I mean, I'm not talking about the way they actually deal with brute diamonds, but generally speaking, it is indivisible, which means that it is a historical individual, and that is why you get that particular phrase, individual, which you would never use of the piece of coal unless it was a particular piece of coal that you threw through the window of some minister. But otherwise, that is in fact what he sees as the essential difference. But that is not the same, I think, as saying that there is an epistemological difference when you apply the value relation that you want to use in selecting certain elements. It may come down to a discussion which I think we should not have today because it is very long and rather complicated, which is whether Rickert or Weber thought that brute reality had a structure or did not have a structure. I think I have now become convinced by others that it had a structure. But of course, if it didn't have a structure, then you might be right, because if it didn't have a structure to start with, then the value would in fact be what gave it structure. But I don't think that was Rickert, and I don't think it's Weber either. Finally, just a word or two on the ideal type. The ideal type is a hoary subject, and much has been written about it, and much nonsense, in fact, has been written about it. One thing that I've always come back to when I look at ideal types is the great difference between what Weber is describing in the objectivity essay, and of course this is about the only, apart from the introduction to Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, the only place where he really makes a long, coherent, systematic argument about something that has to do with method. The distinction between what he describes there and what we still are forced, because he himself uses the word, to call ideal types in, for instance, the first part of Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, all sorts of what one might otherwise call definitions of this or that, Handel and so on and so forth. I mean, there are what I call rich ideal types, which are the early ones and very often the individual ones, and lean individual ideal types, which would tend to be the ones where in fact you try to collect a large number of different objects with some sort of common feature under one particular hat. So there you have the what I think is an important aspect in that respect. And I suspect that you would prefer to discuss ideal types of the richer kind, because obviously that gives more. I have just to finish off, I have just read an article about a man who tries to read the philosopher Bishop Berkeley from within, that is, adopting his own religious principles. And the reviewer says that this, of course, would not appeal to many people today because he had some very weird views of religion. But nevertheless, he thinks it's the right way, because otherwise, he says, if you cut out religion of that sort of analysis, it would be rather like looking at Leonardo's Last Supper and discussing it as an example of table manners in the 1st century BC. So rather to say that, I mean, the element that you introduce when you introduce the religious interpretation makes all the difference to what is essentially the same picture in each case. Sorry, that was perhaps going a little bit off, but nevertheless, yes, thank you.
All right, before we move to Erik, just want to say for everyone who's listening, if you want to ask a question following Erik's response now, like you can raise your hand or maybe write it in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we'll go to you as soon as Erik is finished.
Thank you for your comments. I think that what I would like to comment on now is this discussion of the nature of reality, whether or not the brute reality has a structure or not. I would rather put it like this, that the idea of the brute reality is a theoretical construct for, at least for Weber, but also for Rickert, I think. It's something that we can envision, something that we can talk about, something that we can imagine. But the actual reality that we experience is the given reality, the immediate reality, which, you know, both of them talks about. And you know that Weber makes this distinction in the Rocher and Knies essays between Erlebnis and Erfahrung. And Erfahrung is, in English, it's difficult to make this distinction. Maybe you could talk about the lived experience and like the conceptualized experience.
Yeah.
So here I would say that both Rickert and Weber has sort of a phenomenological view on reality. It's very similar to what other later or contemporary phenomenologists try to capture when they try to describe our relation to reality, that we can't really reach or experience or study reality in and of itself as this kind of brute fact or a thing in itself, because the only reality that we can have a experience of is this lived experienced reality. And that the primary level is always already qualitative. That's how we approach reality in the first place. And then we can abstract from that immediate level and construct these natural scientific concepts of like atoms and the structure of a diamond and so on. But on the primary level, the diamond is something that is valuable in a certain sense. And I take it that for both Rickert and Weber, but let's focus on Weber here. the only meaningful way to talk about the reality that we can study as cultural scientists, that is when we're interested in the meaning of phenomena, is this given reality. There's no sense in talking about reality in and of itself when it comes to wanting to understand the meaning of phenomena. So that means that I would say that it's not really an issue whether or not there is a brute reality with a structure or not. What we have is this given reality with Weber uses this word gestalts, like already like preconceived events and phenomena and so on. And that's why I think that we cannot really get around that values will always affect the empirical material in the first place. And that's why the theoretical value relation, when we construct our ideal types or when we analyze the empirical material, it doesn't help. And I think he realizes that himself, even though he can't really sort it out and solve it. That's like my approach.
Right, thank you, Erik. So no one has volunteered so far to ask a question.
I could make a follow-up comment on the ideal type too, if you want to, or would you like to comment first?
Sure. I mean, one thing I wanted to do maybe to encourage, just to make one point in each of our discussions. I have a comment about the discussion, but I wanted to talk about the fact that this discussion is based on essays that have been now newly edited in the critical edition of Max Weber's work in German, the Max Weber Gesamtausgabe, and that now we have perhaps new possibilities to engage with these texts from there's a new, at least, quality to the sources, and they're distributed, and this is where I'm going to ask Edith for some help. So it's mostly in volume 1/7, right? So it's in the section 1 of the writings, and it's volume 7, Zoologik und Methodik der Sozialwissenschaften, and volume 12 as well, which is the Verstehen der Soziologie und Werturteilsfreiheit. But again, and I think this is the whole point, because we'll find methodological reflections in other in other areas of Weber's works, and this is another aspect of the Gesamtausgabe, which makes it that more valuable, because you find Weber's different interests distributed. You find it in places where you don't expect, and you have his courses as well. Edith, would you like to make any more anything else about the Gesamtausgabe relating to our discussion today that maybe can bring new insights?
Yes, hello everybody. I think it's a little bit difficult because in the volume 1/12 we have more 4 parts discussion of Weber. Yes, I think for the discussion today, maybe the notices of Nervi are more important. These are, yes, a sort of aphorisms, you can say, excerpts of Weber done in the very early time of the 20th century, while he was ill and away from Heidelberg. So it's the starting point for his new interest in methodological questions. But I think it's a little bit difficult because we don't have the notices here for discussing them more in detail.
Sure. No, the idea was just to let our listeners know maybe that if they're interested in going in taking a look at the Gesamtausgabe after listening to this discussion, that's something where they could look into. And is that in volume 7 that you just referred to now?
Yes.
It's an appendix to the volume 1/7.
Okay.
And I think Hans-Henrik knows them very well because the originals are in Merseburg and now in Berlin.
Yes, and almost impossible to read.
Yes, but now we have the transcription, so
Yes.
everyone is able to read them.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good source, of course. But I must say that I don't know if I have much to add there, because I think you, Hans-Henrik, really made a terrific, fantastic job when you commented on the nervy fragments in your first article when you published them. So I think that really settles a lot of the discussion on where Weber parts from Rickert. I agree with you on those questions.
I can tell you that when I was sitting in an archive where normally you have to be completely silent, and I came across a postcard in which Weber writes to Marianne, and nobody had seen that before. I'm reading Rickert, who is very good apart from the terminology, and then in brackets, Wert. I cried out. People turned around looking at me because I said to myself, right, that's a smoking gun. And I think it was. Sorry, a personal reflection.
Fantastic. Yeah, Sam Whimster, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, just in terms of Gesamtausgabe, making full use of it, I've recently read flipped through the briefer from 19, what is it? Get this right? 1903 to 1905, which came out fairly recently, and I don't think it's been reviewed, actually. Must have been. Anyway, I couldn't find a review of it just at this moment, but if you, I mean, this is sort of a point to Erik, he may well have done this already. He's sending these letters off to Willy Hellpach, the social psychologist at Leipzig, and also Franz Eulenberg. And he's having this sort of epistolary conversation with them. I mean, correspondence clearly isn't complete. And the Leipzig one is interesting because Weber dislikes intensely the whole Wilhelm Wundt, Karl Lamprecht, Breisig school of thought, which was the materialization of culture. And Willy Hellpach doesn't seem to be past the Leipzig school, even though he's, as I remember correctly, he was at Leipzig. He's more neo-Kantian in broad terms. And you can see that it's a very rich period, this 1903 to the end of 1905, these 2 years. I mean, I'm doing slightly a Peter Ghosh here, not the Protestant ethic, but the whole, you know, what's going on in his head is really quite exceptional, it seems to me, in the creativity of his thought, but it's not systematic. So you can draw out a lot of threads from these letters, it seems to me. For example, here's a letter, 14th of November, 1905, Weber to Karl Vosler. Value-free is purely a classificatory concept whose purpose is the general. Now he's doing something like that when he's writing to Rickert, or when he's writing to Eulenberg or Hellpach. He's always referring to Rickert. He says, you've got to look at Rickert. And he also says more generally, you can't understand our position unless you're situated within what Windelband and Rickert have said. So I agree with Erik in that you haven't got the full text in this very important period. And Weber, he's not apodictic about the ideal type. I mean, that's another interesting point about Erik. You know, when you try and teach this stuff, you know, I've introductory sociology, 100 students, the ideal type. You reduce it to complete simplicity. Now, if you read these letters, Weber keeps on going this way and that way. He says the ideal type could be, this is another letter, where is it? It could be a normative ought. Secondly, an ideal purity of a feature or characteristic. Thirdly, an empirical average. Now, he only means the second one himself, but what I'm trying to say here is that there are schools of thought, the materialization of culture at Leipzig, and of course the whole, I mean, the Russian Knies essay number 2, he refers to that all the time. Hans Henrik, was he actually writing that in 1903 to 1905?
When did he write them? I think we'd better ask Edith about it.
we can simply put it out, but
I'm quite sure he did.
Yeah. Well, we know it's in that period. I'm not sure the exact date. But he really has got it in his head. And of course, you know, when we were doing the translation and I was reading Hans Henrik's translations, I dreaded the footnotes in Russian Knies because they're so long. But in these letters, and they're intricate, I don't know how Hans Henrik translated them. However, applause for Hans Henrik, I think. But then he starts talking in those footnotes about Ebbinghaus and Münsterberg, yeah, another psychological school. So you find that you've got these schools of thought and they're pressing in on him. And I think I made the point in the introduction that, you know, he's actually fighting schools of thought, which have clear scientific programs based on what he considers perverse ontologies. Wundt, the neo-Hegelians, and he's fascinated by psychology because this is new territory. With, you know, he's quite interested in Ebbinghaus and Münsterberg, and so that's my contribution. The ideal type is not cut and dried. Actually, I will say one last thing. When I teach it, and this question of objectivity, you've got to come to a simplification, because when everybody talks about objectivity, they start talking about subjectivity. And you always see that in the Categorian essay in 1913, that long footnote, I differ from Simmel in this respect. And you always think, well, how does he differ? Because in terms of a sort of phenomenological approach, he's not much different to Simmel, it seems to me. That's a bit of a Lichtblau interpretation. So you're still left with the problem, what is objectivity? Well, in my view, it's just facts, it's the empirical. So there's the ideal type, which is the mechanism, right? And that's the pedagogy of it, both in teaching Max Weber and in researching history and social science. You need an ideal type. It's an instrument. But I'm not going to conclude that Weber was an instrumentalist in his methodology.
Edith, did you want to come in? Did you raise your hand? No? All right. Erik, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I would like to. Thank you, Sam. It's nice to hear your reflections, and I completely understand the difficulties of teaching this stuff to students. First of all, I kind of see what you mean when you want to reduce objectivity to like the fact level. And I think that that's quite fair maybe when we talk about like natural science and quantitative social science and so on. And in that sense, there is a kind of objectivity that is related to this kind of reduction of the qualitative reality to a quantitative version of that reality. But that doesn't really solve what it would mean to reach objectivity in the cultural sciences, right? So what I have tried to develop in my dissertation is a suggestion that we should rather look at this like this. A theory or an account has some sort of objective validity if it's helpful when we try to act in the world. If it makes us able to make successful predictions, it has an aspect of objective validity in that particular sense. And that point can be made even if we say that the content of the description is colored by our values and subjective in that sense. So you could have a description of a historical event or a historical progress that is subjective in the sense that it's colored by values, but that gives us a sort of understanding that makes us know what to do if we want to reach certain goals. So in that sense, it could be objective still. That's my suggestion of how to solve this distinction. And when it comes to the ideal types, and this is also a response to Hans Henrik, of course, I'm interested in the rich ideal types. But I think it's also interesting to see that even if we have these simple, clear-cut ideal types that looks like pure definitions, very short and so on, we can still use them as objects of comparisons. So we can still use both the short and clear ideal types and the rich ideal types as a tool rather than a tool for comparisons, which helps us make judgments rather than as a classificatory framework that we just sort or classify the reality with the help of. So that's like my point. Thank you.
All right. Yes, and Henrik, go ahead.
Two points. The first, it struck me, Erik, when you were talking about the ideal type as being helpful for the facts as being helpful for our orientation in the world. I tried, at least initially, to make a reading of the rich ideal types as they are described by Weber in the objectivity essay, by asking myself, why does he say that they should be internally consistent? And the only reason I can find is that only if they are internally consistent, and I think he has one discussion of what he called the Handwerksgesellschaft, and there might be others, only if they're internally consistent can you expect with consistency to deduce what people living in that kind of society, how they would act in a given situation. Now, of course, you can talk about internal consistency for rich ideal types, but not really for lean ideal types, because what would it mean in that case? And my point there would be rather adding on to what you were ended up by saying, that if you have the rather leaner ideal types of, say, the beginning of a Wirtschaft and Gesellschaft, you're quite right. They can still be used for comparison in a very useful way. My question then would be, but surely couldn't definitions also be used in that way? And I don't think we should get on with that, but I mean, there is a real problem somewhere in this respect.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that this is a long discussion, of course, and it's not this is not the right time and place for that.
No.
But I would just say that my basic point of view is that we have to understand the objectivity or the objective validity of scientific results as related to our part of society, how we act in society. That's like the main framework. It's in relation to how we act in society that we can make sense of what it means for a social scientific or a scientific result at large to be objective.
All right, we have a question from Yanis Kitenis, or he raised his hand. Also, Octavio. All right, go ahead, Yanis.
Please, Octavio, go ahead. I think you were first, or? Okay. So thank you. First of all, I would like to say I'm very, very happy to be here with you tonight. Great commentators and translators such as Henrik Bruun, Whimster, Erik Jansson, people I have from which I have used the texts and translations in my dissertation here in Athens, Greece. Actually, I had contacted Henrik Bruun once to ask him whether he could contribute a paper in a collected volume I edited last year for the anniversary from 100 years since Weber's death. He couldn't, that's totally acceptable, but he directed me towards Sven Eliasson, who actually participated in the volume with an excellent paper, which has a lot to do with what we discuss here today. Just for 1 second, let me show you this is the edited volume. That's not advertising, it's in Greek, so you cannot read it, but still I wanted to. But apart from the great Weber scholars here tonight, I am also very happy to meet young people around my age and to see that our academic interests are very much have a lot in common. And I was really happy to when I read Erik's paper, Erik's post on the site of Weber Scholar Network, to see that we have common interests. For example, I was very much intrigued by the importance he attributes to the concept of meaning and significance, right? Because in my dissertation, I studied the intellectual relationship between Max Weber and Cornelius Castoriadis, a Greek-French philosopher. And the idea, the central idea, the core argument was that we can examine their relationship through an emphasis on the element of meaning. So these were the reasons why I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. Just two tiny remarks regarding Erik's presentation. First of all, I agree very much with your idea, Erik, that we can trace some philosophical and I would say indeed ontological elements in Weber's writings. Because, for example, the basic distinction between sein and sollen, the insistence on the impossibility of reconciliation between values, that gives to Weber's writings this sense of tragedy. I often, when I read his pages, sometimes I feel like he had a sad but dignified smile in his face, what Thomas Mann would call a wounded hero, a person who says, dennoch, we have all these problems, we are in such a hard situation, but still we have to, the concept of Macht, or the concept of Kampf, this struggle for life, all these things are philosophical and indeed ontological conceptions, I think. Even his conception of reality, which is of course borrowed by Rickert, reality as an unübersehbare Mannigfaltigkeit. So I want to say you cannot have, of course, a methodology that is completely separated from the ontology of the object you want to study. That is my view. Okay, so that was the first comment, that I too find really fruitful this idea of reading Weber to find in his writings philosophical ideas or remarks. And regarding the topics of truth and objectivity, there are huge topics, of course, we cannot hear today, but I want to say that in my personal work, I have found really helpful the idea that, for example, Stephen Turner uses in his work about lawyer as a social thinker. We all know Weber studied the law at first, like myself, because I also made a similar turn in my, I was studying law and then went on to the social sciences. But I think that there is there a way of thinking, all these remarks regarding the legal causality, how the jurist can attribute to Rechnen a causal relation to. I think that Weber thinks of objectivity as a empirically adequate attribution of some, let's say, of a historic constellation to some causes. That's the way he tries to think of a non-subjective causality in history. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your remarks. Your speeches were absolutely amazing, and I'm really here to be here with you. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Jens. This is fantastic. And just a few comments. Maybe you could present your book to us and tell us, because if Greek is not accessible to us, and I don't know if you sent it to Edith yet, who I guess is the collector of all things that come out on Weber, because there's no Weber library, right? So the Bavarian Academy of Science is now the place that most of us will go, because Edith happens to get everything, not everything, most of the things that are published. So I guess, yeah, this would be a possibility.
Yes, of course. Edith, would you like me to send you via mail, via the post, a hard copy of the book?
Yes, this would be.
Yes,
Well, we have the contact, so it would be very nice if you would send the book to our library.
Of course.
Okay, thank you, Janis.
And if I'm also getting, and if the essay from Eliasson has only been published in Greek, maybe we could see it in Max Weber Studies. I don't know. Or it'd be cool if this is only exist in Greek to.
I think it's you know, a sum up and a compilation of older texts of his, but
Okay.
I think that the original it is an original essay on objectivity and normativity. Exactly. That's why I said that it. And I also wanted to say to you, given the nice atmosphere of this company, that German is the third language I studied in order to read Weber. So I come from the French because I read Castoriadis, and in the book there are many not many, but there is a whole environment, I mean, of French contributors. There is a text of Béatrice Hibou, who occupies herself with the concept of neoliberal bureaucracy, Aurélien Berlin, and also I have some communication with Jean-Pierre Grosjean, who has translated and written prefaces for almost every. So I think it could be nice if sometime we could arrange for someone of the French community, Weber community, to present something here.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, we have a lot of members in the French speaking world, not only in France but also in Canada. And there's going to be a big Weber conference next year in France. But we're going to write about that, and I'd be very happy if you also. We'll exchange these contacts if you want. So we're coming towards the end. We have to go to Octavio still. Just one remark about you talked about the lawyer as a social thinker. I think one intuition. Weber was also a teacher and writes about objectivity a lot from the standpoint of teaching and of the fact that you shouldn't be delivering prophecies from your lectern. And that's also a reflection on objectivity. And I feel, so if we're thinking about context to all these reflections, it's his work as a teacher as a professor in the end of the 1890s. And this is in volume 13 of the Max Weber Gesamtausgabe, where it's everything. Weber is like this academic in the concrete sense, departmental meetings and, who are you going to hire? And there's a particular struggle with Brentano about who to hire for a position, where all of these issues of objectivity surface in a very concrete, everyday kind of environment, which is the, running a university department. So I think this is also kind of a clue, an intuition I hope to develop one day with you guys. Now to Octavio. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. First of all, I will rely in some notes that I made because I do not trust in my ability to improvise in English. I want to say, like Janis, that it's a real honor being here with a lot of people I knew first only as the author of the articles that made me learn the complexity and deepness of Weber thought. And then I have one question in the regular sense of the term, and the other is more like a reflection from which I can artificially extract a precise question, but it does not reduce to it. The first is to Erik, because I have some curiosity on the theoretical influence of your philosophical approach, because I can distinguish perhaps a influence of Leo Strauss' ways of reading the history of thought, or I don't know, of Karl Lowitz's ones. So that's like a very simple question. And I think that when we read a text, we find two problems that could be distinguished: the meaning of the text and the significance of the text. And I am here using Skinnerian terms. even when you say that one should add something to the text, you make a difference between the text and oneself making this addition. So the question arises in a logical sense. It's the same validity criteria when we ask about the meaning of the text and his significance. We can separate both works. I think that even though, or rather precisely, because it's very difficult to separate it, that we need to try it. That is my question to you and the reflection. But then I have a more general reflection that I need to say, first of all, that my position is based in an almost a priori polemical one. Like, it's not reading Weber as the major part of the 20th century did it. No, I think that the reading of Weber that the century made speak more about the scientific views and problems of the 20th century that Weber's one. So there is like a paradox, because I think that trying to read Weber as Weber interpreted himself, that it is like an objective way of reading Weber with all the problems it have, is at the same time a polemical one. I need to say that I agree almost entirely with Henrik Bruun, perhaps because we are both, if I didn't hear bad, political scientists. I have a great problem with reading Max Weber methodology, that it's like reproducing the idea, the overwhelming idea that Weber was a methodologist, you know, and it was perhaps one of his key concerns. And when I read all the texts about methodological problems in Weber, I could not always think about something, that objectivity is a problem of scientific praxis, and methodology is like a theoretical reflection about a practice. So here we have something that Weber distinguish a lot, that it's logical problems with practical problems. And I think that it's in Roger and Mies that when Weber says that trying to solve practical problems with theoretical and logical reflection is like a return to scholasticity. I don't know how it's said in English. I think that this difference between logical distinctions and practice at all, not only political, but also scientific, is forgotten or underrated in the 20th century. For example, in the diagnosis of the fight between gods and demons and the polythemes of values, that it isn't a statement of what in empirical life it's happening for Weber. No? Because in empirical life, Weber says that it's possible a dialogue between values or positions that implicates different and contradictory values seen from a logical point of view. So I think that that's why Weber didn't write an exhaustive and definitive methodological essays, but different essays trying to solve some practical problems that he saw that the practice of the science of his time was having. And I think we can extend this absence of exhaustive and definitive methodological essay to the absence of, for example, a political theory or economic theory in Max Weber's works. And it's perhaps this absence or this difference between the logical and the practical planes of reality that perhaps explains the contradiction or difference in the intensity of an argument that Weber has. Because I have the intuition that every text is Weber fighting with some argument. Like it's not the same with Edward Meyers that is with Roger and Mies, and most of all because Weber tries to have like a middle position between two positions, you know, that it's like the irrational and subjective, almost artistic form of exercising history, you know, and in the other side, like the naturalistic one. At the same time that we have the problem with the basic empirism or something like that, and the theoretical and only exclusive approach. I think that it's almost all. I said it was not the second one a real question, but I really think that, and I want to hear about what you think about this, the importance of this separation between logical problems and practice problems, and how it works inside WEBER work also. Thank you.
Thanks, Otavio. So go ahead, Erik. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I start with the last question, I would say that if I remember correctly, I tried to find the passage here, but I recall that it says that under normal circumstances, there is no need for methodological reflections. But when we are in a state of crisis, or when there's a confusion or something like that, I can't remember the exact phrase here. That's when methodology or methodological reflections are useful. And I think that Weber thinks that that's the case in his time, and that's why it's justified to spend time on methodological reflections. And I think that's also true for us today. That I think we have to remember that, or I like to say it like this, that social science in general is a really young science. Social science haven't been around for that long. So I think we need to have that bigger perspective and realize that there's so much left to understand when it comes to the potential of social scientific knowledge. And there's so much to still discover when it comes to how to do social science proper from a historical perspective. So I don't think that he's really that skeptical of methodological reflections. I think he really tried to make sense of the basic methodological and ontological and epistemological foundations of what he was trying to do in his practical studies. So I think it's more a case of not succeeding in putting his thoughts into a more structured way, rather than that he's not interested in it. That's my comment there. And when it comes to your first question, please correct me if I misunderstood your point here, but I took it that you wanted to address the issue of what it means to make a valid interpretation from my perspective when I say that we should add something, or we need to add something when we make an interpretation. Was that sort of what you were after?
I think that that question is better than mine. So,
okay. So I would say that there is no such thing as a complete description of an event in reality. You always have to choose what to describe, and you have to choose from which perspective, and that's where this theoretical value relation is important. And I think it's the same when it comes to reading and interpreting and studying texts too, that there is no such thing as a complete or correct interpretation, in the sense that you could somehow grasp the complete meaning or intention or something like that. Because when we write, and especially someone like Weber writes in a way that there's so much going on that he can't really put into words. So it's not like there's a correct answer, I think. So we always have to add something. And when it comes to my theoretical influences, I would say that my main theoretical influence is Wittgenstein, and especially his late writings. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a very big influence on mine.
All right. Yeah, we're coming towards the end, so I'm going to go to Sam Whimster and then maybe ask Hans-Henrik and Erik to give some concluding words. All right, Sam.
Yes, well, just to say, this question of logic and methodology in cultural science is worth looking at a letter to Franz Eulenberg, 16th of April, 1905 for the record, Rickert is not a great man, but a gifted logician. And as a logician, I think Weber simply means he's worked out what cultural sciences are. He says the last third of the objectivity essay is pure Rickert. And so Rickert solved, it's a division of labor. Rickert solved that problem. Then Weber's brought the ideal type to it. But it's a terrible thing to say of your close colleague. He's not a great man, but I think the inference is that Max Weber was the great man.
All right, Hans-Henrik, any concluding words?
Not much, really. I think that in what Sam just quoted, in fact, Oldenburg had been writing to Weber that Rickert was a great man. And so it was not a gratuitous remark on Weber's part, but rather to say that I don't hold him to be a great man, but a very capable logician. And I think you said that the last third of the objectivity essay was pure Rickert. Now that would be news to me, because that was the part that Weber says in a letter, that this is the only part of the essay which I really feel is my own contribution and not Rickert's. And of course, Rickert hated the ideal type and wrote around it as much as he could. But I may have misunderstood you. Otherwise, I would simply say that I found it extremely interesting to be here with such a good group of people who can show us new ways of thinking about what we mistakenly thought was the only way to look at these things. So thank you very much for letting me come into this forum as well.
Yeah, thank you, Hans-Henrik. It's been this incredible privilege to have you with us today. Yeah, Erik?
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you to Hans-Henrik for giving me all of these fruitful thoughts and comments and reflections. It's been an honor to discuss this with you. And thank you everyone who showed up and we're here to listen to our conversation. And thank you, Victor and Brenda, for arranging this. It's fantastic. So thank you.
All right, fantastic. So just some concluding remarks. So we close today and already in some advertising as well. So just wanted to say that I pick out just a few sentences of the interventions that I want to close with, because they speak a lot to the goals of this network and what we're trying to do. So Hans-Henrik reminded us that a fundamental Weberian premise is that we choose and fight for our values, but we cannot prove that they're the right ones. And while I guess there's a lot of ink has been spilled over this basic premise, I think there's value in reminding us of it and in formulating it so well. And I guess we're by no means done drawing all the ramifications of this premise. And one original one raised by Erik tonight was that as a social scientist, you should be able to have distance from the theoretical tool you are constructing. So, or as a social scientist, you should be able to have distance from the research tool you construct. And I think it's a direct connection to that Weberian axiom, let's say, that Hans-Henrik had raised earlier. And Erik also said something that is really exactly what we're trying to do, which is finding in Weber that to which there are no conventions to express. And so the unconventional Weber, and this can come from various sources and from all, from different participants of this network of all kinds. And so I wanted to start with this idea of looking for this unconventional Weber. So if you don't know that already, we have a website, which is weberscholars.net. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter there. We have a Facebook page, also under WSN, Weber Scholars Network. And the next event we already have in the works is going to feature Octavio, who just raised an interesting question. So Octavio Majul from Buenos Aires is going to be discussing Weber and Nietzsche. He's already written a text on it that we're going to be publishing soon. With Camilla Emenegger from Italy, Christian Marzi from Switzerland, and this event will be moderated by Edith Hanke. And this will take place in February. We don't know the date already, but we'll tell you about it soon. Thank you all again. Thanks for everyone who participated. Thank you, Brenda, for all the help organizing this. And we'll see you next time. So thank you, everyone. Good night.